A familiar silence. In the small town of Maplebrook, the streets lay under the heavy shroud of darkness as the last remnants of evening dissolved into the stillness of the night. Maplebrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, and secrets were thought to be few. But for Sheriff Marcus Darnell, the quiet nights in his town had become a source of dread, a silence that reminded him of the ghosts he couldn't escape. At 48 years old, Sheriff Darnell was a man worn by years of service, his graying hair tucked neatly under his wide-brimmed hat, his face lined with the weight of personal grief. He sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the engine idling as he stared out onto the deserted streets. He'd volunteered for the night shift for the past 3 years, preferring the isolation it afforded him. His colleagues were more than happy to let him have it, especially since most of them had families to go home to, a luxury Marcus had lost years ago. A tattered photo on his dashboard captured a different time. A time when his world was full, not empty. His wife, Carmen, with her radiant smile, and their daughter, Kayla, who was only 10 when tragedy struck. A car accident had taken them both, leaving Marcus adrift in a world that no longer made sense. He couldn't move on, so he let the darkness of the night become his comfort, a place where memories were easier to contain. As the clock ticked past midnight, Marcus sipped from his thermos, grimacing at the bitter coffee, and prepared to make his nightly rounds. Maplebrook didn't have much in the way of excitement, and that was fine by him. His patrol route was predictable, up and down Main Street, around the residential areas, past the quiet diner that stayed open late. He liked knowing what to expect. No surprises. But tonight was different. As Marcus drove past the laundromat on the corner of Sycamore and 8th, a faint light spilled from the windows, the hum of old fluorescent bulbs audible even from inside his patrol car. It was open 24 hours, but hardly anyone ever used it at this time of night. As he glanced through the glass windows, something caught his eye. A small figure inside, moving methodically between the rows of machines. Slowing down, Marcus squinted through the windshield. It was a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, her hair pulled back in braids, wearing an oversized hoodie that seemed to swallow her small frame. She stood on her tiptoes, loading clothes into a washing machine, her movements slow and deliberate, almost as if she had done this 100 times before. Marcus frowned. What was a child doing here at this hour? Alone. He watched for a moment longer, thinking that perhaps her parents were nearby, but the laundromat was otherwise empty. His instincts kicked in, the ones honed from years of police work. This didn't sit right with him. He drove past the laundromat, intending to circle back and keep an eye on the situation. The night wore on in its usual quiet, but as Marcus continued his rounds, he couldn't shake the image of the girl. Something about her had stirred an unease in him, a familiar tightness in his chest. His mind drifted to Kayla, how she'd loved to stay up late, claiming to be independent. It was little things like that that made him miss her all the more. After an hour of patrolling, Marcus found himself back at the laundromat, parked across the street, the laundromat's glow cutting through the dark. The girl was still there, sitting on a bench, her small legs swinging off the edge as she stared at the spinning washer. There was no sign of an adult. Marcus's frown deepened. A young girl alone, in the middle of the night, in a laundromat. It wasn't right. But he hesitated. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe her mother was running late. He had learned from experience that rushing in without understanding the full situation could cause more harm than good. But as the minutes ticked by and no adult appeared, his concern grew. With a sigh, Marcus stepped out of his car, pulling his jacket tighter against the cool autumn air. He crossed the street, his boots echoing faintly as they hit the pavement. The laundromat door opened with a soft chime as he entered. The girl didn't look up, too focused on folding clothes that seemed far too large for her. Marcus cleared his throat softly. "Hey there." The girl startled slightly, her eyes widening as they darted toward him. She froze, the laundry half folded in her hands. "Don't worry, I'm not here to cause any trouble," Marcus said, keeping his voice gentle. He crouched slightly to meet her at eye level. "I'm Sheriff Darnell. What's your name?" She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes filled with both fear and defiance. After a long pause, she mumbled, "Lila." Marcus nodded. "Hi, Lila. Do you live nearby? Where's your family?" The girl looked down at the pile of clothes in her lap, her hands fidgeting with the fabric. I live with my grandma," she whispered. Marcus's heart ached at the sight of her, so small and vulnerable. He wanted to help, but he knew pushing too hard too soon might make her shut down. "Your grandma, huh? She at home right now?" Lila nodded slowly but didn't offer any more details. The sheriff could see she wasn't going to volunteer much, and he didn't want to scare her off. "Okay. Well, it's pretty late for you to be out here all alone, don't you think?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Got laundry to do." There was something in her voice, a quiet determination, that gave Marcus pause. He studied her for a moment, trying to piece together what was going on. Why would a little girl be doing laundry in the middle of the night? And why did she seem so used to it? Just then, the dryer buzzed loudly, breaking the tension. Layla stood up quickly, eager to escape the conversation. Marcus watched as she hurried over to the dryer, pulling out a load of clothes and folding them with surprising care. As she worked, he noticed how worn her clothes looked, the frayed edges of her sleeves, and the way her shoes were scuffed and too big for her small feet. Something wasn't right here, and Marcus wasn't about to let it go. But as he stood there, watching Lila fold clothes with the precision of someone far older, he knew he'd have to approach this carefully. He couldn't just swoop in and solve the mystery. This would take time. But he was patient. After all, the night was long, and Marcus Darnell had all the time in the world to uncover the truth. Beneath the surface, Sheriff Marcus Darnell sat in his patrol car, the engine off, watching from a distance as Layla finished folding the last of the clothes. His mind whirred with questions, but instinct told him not to rush this. Something about the girl tugged at his heart in a way he hadn't felt in years. There was a quiet sorrow in her eyes, a look he had once known all too well. It was the same look that had stared back at him in the mirror after he'd lost Carmen and Kayla, the look of someone trying to survive when everything around them was crumbling. Maplebrook wasn't a place for big mysteries. The small town prided itself on its simplicity, where everyone's business was everyone else's. But sometimes the deepest struggles happened quietly, behind closed doors. And it was becoming more evident that Layla's late-night trips to the laundromat were one of those struggles. As Layla placed the last folded shirt in a large worn-out laundry bag, Marcus tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, trying to decide his next move. He could feel it in his gut. There was more to this story. But approaching too aggressively could drive the girl into further silence. What he needed was more information, more understanding of her life, so he could figure out how best to help. When Layla finally hefted the laundry bag over her small shoulders, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped out of his car, walking toward the laundromat again. The girl paused when she saw him, her body tense, as if expecting to be reprimanded. But Marcus softened his stance, offering her a small, kind smile. "You heading home now, Layla?" he asked, his voice calm and friendly. Layla hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her shoes before nodding. She shifted the weight of the laundry bag, her arms trembling slightly under the strain. "Mind if I walk with you?" Marcus continued, sensing the unease in her. "Just to make sure you get home safe. It's a late hour for anyone, especially a young girl." Her eyes darted to his face, searching for something. Perhaps a hint of malice or judgment, but finding none. After a long moment, she gave a small nod, and together, they started walking through the dimly lit streets of Maplebrook. The town was quiet, as it always was at this hour. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the occasional sound of a distant car engine or the rustle of leaves in the wind broke the stillness. Marcus walked slowly beside her, keeping pace, his hands in his pockets. He didn't want to make her feel cornered, but the silence between them felt heavy, filled with the unspoken questions hanging in the air. "So, your grandma," Marcus began gently, breaking the silence. "Is she waiting for you at home?" Layla shrugged, her steps steady but slow. "She's probably asleep by now." "Must be hard, taking care of all this by yourself," Marcus said, nodding toward the bag on her back. "Seems like a lot for someone your age." Layla was quiet for a moment, her face set in a careful expression. She glanced up at Marcus briefly, then looked back down at the sidewalk. "I'm used to it," she muttered. There was something in her tone that made Marcus's heart ache, a resignation that no child should ever have to feel. He didn't press the point, though. He understood too well how some wounds were too deep to be prodded carelessly. As they walked, Marcus kept a casual eye on their surroundings. They passed by darkened houses, the windows reflecting the glow of the streetlights. Maplebrook might have been small, but it had its own share of hardships, tucked away behind the perfect suburban facades. They turned onto a side street that led toward the older part of town, where the houses were smaller and more worn. The houses here were nothing like the picturesque homes that lined Main Street. They were more modest, some with chipped paint and overgrown lawns. It was a neighborhood that had seen better days, where people lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping by however they could. Layla's pace quickened slightly as they neared a small house at the end of the street, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of age. The yard was untidy, with scattered leaves and a rusted old car in the driveway. The front porch light flickered, barely illuminating the weathered wooden steps. "This is it," Layla said quietly, stopping at the edge of the driveway. Marcus took in the sight of the house, his eyes lingering on the cracked windows and the peeling paint. It wasn't the kind of place that screamed warmth or comfort, but it was clearly home to Layla. A part of him wanted to ask her more about her situation, to find out what kind of life she lived behind those walls. But he held back. He could already sense that trust was fragile with her, and he wasn't about to break it by prying too much too soon. "You got everything you need in there?" he asked, nodding toward the house. Layla hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, we're fine." Marcus wasn't so sure. There was something about the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself more than him. But again, he didn't push. "All right," he said, taking a step back. "If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." Layla looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering porch light. For a moment, she seemed like she wanted to say something, but then she closed her mouth, nodding instead. "Thanks," she whispered, before turning and walking up the driveway. Marcus watched as she disappeared into the house, the door closing softly behind her. The flickering light on the porch gave one last sputter before going out entirely, leaving the yard in darkness. He stood there for a moment, the cold night air biting at his skin. Something was deeply wrong, and he knew it. But without any real evidence, there was little he could do, at least for now. What he needed was to learn more about Layla's life, and the only way to do that was by being patient, watching from the sidelines until the time was right to intervene. The next day, Marcus made it a point to dig deeper into Layla's background. He didn't want to overstep, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than met the eye. He started with a few quiet inquiries around town, nothing too formal, just casual conversations with people who might know something about the girl and her family. Maplebrook's gossip mill was always turning, and it didn't take long for Marcus to pick up bits and pieces of information. Layla lived with her grandmother, Mrs. Marie Ellis, who was well known in the neighborhood for being a tough, no-nonsense woman. She had raised her own children years ago, and had now taken in Layla after some family issues that no one seemed too keen on discussing. From what Marcus gathered, Mrs. Ellis had been struggling with her health lately. She'd been in and out of the hospital, and though no one knew the full details, there were whispers that she wasn't as sharp as she used to be. It was clear that Layla had taken on more responsibilities at home than any child should have to bear. It wasn't long before Marcus found himself standing in front of the town's records office, where old case files and public documents were kept. He wasn't one to pry into people's lives without reason, but something about this situation nagged at him. If Layla's grandmother was in poor health, and the girl was essentially taking care of things on her own, what would happen if things got worse? After a bit of searching, Marcus found what he was looking for: an old record from Child Protective Services. It was from a few years ago, around the time Layla had come to live with her grandmother. According to the file, Layla's mother had struggled with substance abuse, and her father had been in and out of jail. The courts had deemed the situation unstable, and Layla had been placed with her grandmother as a last resort. Marcus closed the file, his heart heavy. Layla had already lived through so much. No wonder she seemed so closed off, so self-reliant. She had been forced to grow up too quickly, shouldering responsibilities that no child should have to face. As Marcus left the records office, his mind raced with thoughts of how to help. He knew he couldn't just swoop in and change Layla's life overnight, but there had to be something he could do. He'd been a sheriff for years, but this situation, this small, fragile girl, was unlike anything he'd ever dealt with. His instincts told him that Layla was in more trouble than she was letting on. But he also knew that rushing in without understanding the full picture could cause more harm than good. What he needed was time, to build trust, to learn more about her life, and to find a way to help her without making things worse. As Marcus drove through the quiet streets of Maplebrook that night, his thoughts kept returning to the little girl at the laundromat, alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, folding clothes that weren't even hers. He knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Cracks in the armor. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension in Sheriff Marcus Darnell's life. Every evening, he found himself driving the same route, eyes scanning the streets, the laundromat, and Layla's small house. She was like a ghost in his mind, a presence he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to focus on the other duties of his job. The small, worn house at the end of Maple Street stayed dark most nights. On a few occasions, he caught a glimpse of Layla, her small frame weighed down by that oversized laundry bag, her expression set in a quiet determination. It was a mask he knew well, one meant to keep the world at a distance. She didn't want help. She had taught herself that it was better not to need anyone. And that's what scared Marcus the most. She had been taught, through experience, that people let you down. On one chilly October evening, after another shift of uneventful patrols and paperwork, Marcus decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had to do more than just watch from the sidelines. His gut told him something was going to break soon. Whether it was Layla, her health, or the fragile life she had patched together at home, he wasn't sure. But if he didn't step in now, it might be too late. Marcus parked his cruiser a block away from Layla's house and walked the rest of the way. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the town cloaked in shadow, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The wind carried a biting chill, signaling the first hints of the coming winter. He tugged his jacket tighter around his shoulders as he approached the house, his boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway. The house was quiet, just as it always was. The front yard, overgrown with weeds and scattered leaves, gave off an air of abandonment. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his hand raised to knock, before lowering it again. What was he going to say? What could he say that wouldn't come off as prying or invasive? But just as he turned to leave, a noise from inside caught his attention. A faint, muffled sound. A voice, but not Layla's. Marcus frowned, his instincts flaring up. He hadn't heard anyone else in that house before. He walked to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and peered inside. The living room was dimly lit, illuminated by a single weak lamp on the corner table. And there, on the old threadbare couch, lay Mrs. Ellis, Layla's grandmother. She was speaking, but it was unclear if she was talking to herself or to someone else. Her words were slurred, her movements sluggish. It didn't take long for Marcus to realize she wasn't in good shape. Layla was seated on the floor next to the couch, her head bent over a notebook, scribbling something furiously. Her face was tight with concentration, but the deep bags under her eyes betrayed how exhausted she really was. Marcus knew that look too. The look of someone who was running on empty, trying to hold it together even though every piece of their life felt like it was falling apart. He knocked gently on the door, not wanting to startle them. Layla's head snapped up instantly, her eyes wide with panic. Mrs. Ellis, too disoriented to react, simply mumbled something unintelligible. Layla hurried to the door, opening it just a crack, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and tense. Marcus felt a pang of guilt at the fear in her voice, but he knew he couldn't walk away now. "I wanted to check on you," he said softly. "I was in the neighborhood and—" "I'm fine," she interrupted quickly, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "We're fine. You don't need to worry." Marcus gently pushed the door open a little more, enough to see Mrs. Ellis more clearly. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her breathing was shallow. Marcus's heart clenched in his chest. "Layla," he said quietly, "your grandmother doesn't look well. She needs help." Layla's face hardened, her small fists clenched at her sides. "I'm taking care of her. I can handle it." Marcus shook his head, stepping inside the house despite Layla's attempts to block him. "You're a strong girl, Layla, but this isn't something you should have to do alone." Layla's lips trembled, but she set her jaw firmly. "I don't have a choice," she muttered, her voice breaking just a little. "If they find out I can't take care of her, they'll take me away. They'll put me in a foster home or send me to some strangers. I can't let that happen. I won't." Marcus swallowed hard, understanding the depth of her fear. Layla had already lost so much, and the last thing she wanted was to be separated from the only family she had left. But this wasn't sustainable. She was just a child, and the weight she was carrying was crushing her. "Layla," Marcus said gently, kneeling down to her level, "nobody is going to take you away if we ask for help the right way. Your grandmother is sick, and you're doing everything you can. But this is too much for you to handle alone. There are people who can help her. Help both of you. I promise you won't be taken away." Layla looked at him with tears brimming in her eyes, her shoulders shaking as she tried to keep her emotions in check. She glanced back at her grandmother, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, and then down at the notebook in her hands. Marcus noticed, for the first time, that it wasn't homework or doodles. It was a list. An impossibly long list of things to do. Things to remember, things to clean, bills to pay. She was holding her family together with nothing but scraps of paper and sheer willpower. Marcus's heart broke for her. "I don't want her to go to a nursing home," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to be alone." "You won't be alone," Marcus said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Layla wiped her eyes quickly, but the tears kept coming. She was too tired to fight anymore, too tired to keep pretending everything was okay. Marcus reached out and gently took the notebook from her hands, flipping through the pages filled with shaky handwriting. "This isn't your responsibility, Layla," he said softly. "You deserve to be a kid, to go to school, to have friends, to dream about your future. You can't do that if you're trying to be everything for everyone else." For the first time, Layla looked vulnerable, truly vulnerable. Her defenses, so carefully built up, were starting to crack. She looked at Marcus with wide, scared eyes. "But if I don't take care of her, who will?" "We will," Marcus said gently. "We'll find a way. Together." Layla hesitated, her fists still clenched at her sides. She had spent so long carrying this weight that she didn't know how to let go. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep going like this. She was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small nod. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached for his radio, calling in for medical assistance. As he spoke to the dispatcher, he glanced back at Layla, who had slumped down onto the floor, her back against the wall. She looked so small, so fragile, sitting there in the dim light. The paramedics arrived shortly after, and Mrs. Ellis was taken to the hospital for a full evaluation. Marcus stayed with Lila the entire time, offering her quiet comfort as she watched her grandmother being wheeled away. It was a long night, but by the time dawn broke over the horizon, Marcus had made good on his promise. He had spoken with social services, explaining the situation, and assured Lila that she wouldn't be taken away. Instead, they would arrange for in-home care for Mrs. Ellis, giving Lila the chance to be a kid again. As they sat in the waiting room of the hospital, Lila leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. It was the first time she had let herself cry in front of anyone. And as Marcus wrapped an arm around her, he knew this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where she didn't have to carry the world on her shoulders anymore. Rebuilding the foundation. The first few days after Mrs. Ellis was admitted to the hospital passed in a blur. Layla barely spoke, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones now that the immediate crisis was over. For so long, she had been running on autopilot, driven by the sheer necessity of survival. Now, with the hospital staff taking care of her grandmother and Marcus by her side, she didn't know what to do with herself. The quiet felt unnerving. Sheriff Marcus Darnell had promised to stay involved, and he kept that promise. He visited Layla every day, making sure she had something to eat, ensuring she got to school, and more importantly, that she had someone to talk to. He made calls to social services, arranged for in-home care, and handled the legal paperwork that would ensure Lila could stay with her grandmother. Each step was carefully calculated to ensure her life wasn't upended again. Despite the assurances, Lila was far from convinced. She had been let down too many times before by systems and people who said they cared but couldn't stick around when things got tough. Trust wasn't something she gave freely anymore, and even with Marcus, there was always a flicker of doubt in her eyes. A fear that he too might one day vanish, leaving her alone to pick up the pieces. But Marcus wasn't going anywhere. It was nearly a week later when Marcus received a call from the hospital. Mrs. Ellis was stable, but her diagnosis was worse than anyone had expected. Early-onset dementia, combined with her physical health issues, meant she couldn't live alone anymore. Layla, despite her determination and love for her grandmother, couldn't provide the care required. As Marcus drove to pick Lila up for the visit, he rehearsed how he'd break the news. This wasn't just about keeping Lila safe. It was about helping her understand that loving someone sometimes meant allowing others to help. But he also knew this conversation would take the delicate balance of a surgeon and the patience of a saint. When Marcus arrived, Lila was sitting on the porch of her small house, her knees drawn up to her chest. The evening sun cast long shadows across the yard, but the warmth in the air had already given way to the crispness of fall. She stood when she saw him, a look of resignation on her face. She was used to bad news. They rode in silence to the hospital. It was a familiar route now, but the tension in the air was palpable. When they reached the hospital room, Mrs. Ellis was awake but disoriented. Her eyes darted around the sterile white walls, and she mumbled under her breath. The strings of her thoughts frayed. Layla walked over to her grandmother and gently took her hand, her face blank, but her knuckles white from gripping too hard. "Hey, Nana," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here." Mrs. Ellis looked up at her, recognition flickering and fading in her eyes. "Lily?" she asked, confused. Layla bit her lip, her shoulders trembling, but she held it together. "No, Nana. It's me, Layla." Mrs. Ellis smiled weakly, her head lolling back onto the pillow. "Layla, that's a pretty name. My granddaughter's name was Layla." Marcus watched the exchange from the doorway, his heart aching for the young girl who had spent so much time being the caregiver and protector in this relationship. He knew what this moment meant to Layla. It was the painful reality that, despite all her efforts, some things were simply beyond her control. When the nurse came to check on Mrs. Ellis, Marcus gently pulled Layla aside and led her into the hallway. "Layla, there's something we need to talk about," Marcus began, his voice soft but steady. "Your grandmother, she's not going to get better." Layla's eyes widened in fear. "What do you mean?" "She just needs more time to rest. I know she's not well, but if I can—" Marcus cut her off, though his tone was kind. "Layla, I know how much you love her, and I know how hard you've been fighting to take care of her. But this isn't something you can fix. She's going to need round-the-clock care soon." Layla's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she crossed her arms over her chest. She blinked rapidly, trying to keep the tears at bay. "But she's all I have left. If I can't take care of her, then what am I supposed to do?" Marcus sighed deeply. He had expected this question, but answering it was harder than he anticipated. "You're not losing her, Layla. But you do need help, and so does she. That's why I've been working with social services to get you both the support you need." Layla's brow furrowed, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Social services? I told you I don't want to be taken away. I won't go to a foster home." "You're not going to a foster home," Marcus reassured her quickly. "Your grandmother will get the medical care she needs, and there's an in-home caregiver who can come to your house and help. That way, you can stay with her, but you won't have to shoulder everything on your own anymore." Layla stared at him, processing the information. It sounded too good to be true, and she had long since stopped believing in fairy tales. And what if it doesn't work? What if they decide to take me away anyway? Marcus crouched down so that he was eye level with her. "Layla, I've already talked to the social workers. They know how strong you are, how much you love your grandmother. You're not going anywhere. But you have to trust me, okay?" For the first time since Marcus had met her, Layla's tough exterior cracked just a little. Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and she looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, then spoke the truth. "Because no one should have to go through what you're going through alone. I grew up in a rough situation too, Layla. And if it weren't for the people who stepped in to help me, I wouldn't be here today. I care because you deserve a chance to have a better life." Layla's lip quivered, and a single tear escaped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, her face hardening again. "I don't want to be a charity case." "You're not a charity case," Marcus said firmly. "You're a fighter, and even fighters need a team." Layla said nothing for a long moment, her eyes downcast, but Marcus could see the internal battle she was fighting. She didn't want to rely on anyone, but the reality of her situation was too heavy for her to bear alone. Finally, she nodded, a small, hesitant motion, but it was enough. It was the first sign that she was ready to let someone in. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to change. With the help of social services and the in-home caregiver, Mrs. Ellis's medical needs were managed, and Layla could focus on her schoolwork again. The weight that had pressed down on her for so long was still there, but it was lighter, shared by people who genuinely cared. Marcus kept his word, visiting regularly and staying involved. He became a mentor of sorts, someone Layla could talk to without fear of judgment. He even helped her with her homework, though he joked that math had changed a lot since he was her age. One evening, as Marcus sat with Layla on the porch, watching the sun set over the town, he noticed something he hadn't seen in her before: hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was a start. "You know," Layla said quietly, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Marcus asked, turning to her. "I want to do something with my life," she said, her voice stronger now. "I don't know what yet, but I want to help people, like you helped me. I want to make a difference." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You already are, Layla. You already are." Finding her voice. The days passed in a strange blend of routine and uncertainty for Layla. With her grandmother receiving the care she needed, the constant pressure on her shoulders began to ease, but it left a void, one she hadn't anticipated. For so long, her world had revolved around keeping things together, surviving day to day. That now, without the immediacy of crisis, she felt a little lost. But it was also the beginning of something new. Layla found herself thinking more and more about what Marcus had said, about making a difference, about not being alone. For the first time in a long while, the future wasn't just something to be feared. It was a question mark, yes, but one filled with possibility rather than dread. One afternoon, as Layla sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, the in-home caregiver, Miss Ruth, bustled about in the living room, tending to Mrs. Ellis. Her grandmother, once sharp and quick-witted, was growing more distant by the day. Some mornings, she didn't recognize Layla at all, while other times, the old spark would return, and they'd share a quiet, meaningful moment. Those moments were rare now, but Layla cherished each one, even if they were fleeting. Suddenly, Layla's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Hey, how's your day going? I've got something to ask you. Meet me at the station after school." Layla hesitated. She still wasn't used to the idea that someone cared about her enough to check in regularly. But Marcus wasn't like anyone else. He had been there when she needed him most, and that was something she didn't take lightly. She quickly typed back, "Sure. I'll be there." After school, Layla made her way to the sheriff's station, her heart thumping slightly in her chest. She wasn't nervous, exactly, just curious. What could Marcus possibly want to talk about? When she arrived, Marcus was standing outside, leaning against his car with his arms crossed, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, kiddo," he greeted her warmly. "You got a minute?" Layla shrugged, trying to play it cool. "I guess. What's up?" Marcus motioned for her to follow him. "There's something I want to show you. Hop in." Layla raised an eyebrow but climbed into the passenger seat without a question. As they drove, Marcus kept the conversation light, asking her about school, how things were going at home, and what she'd been thinking about lately. Layla answered in her usual short sentences, but Marcus didn't push. He seemed to know that she needed space to process her thoughts before she was ready to share them. After a while, they pulled up in front of a small community center on the edge of town. Layla stared out the window, puzzled. "What's this place?" Marcus turned off the engine and faced her. "This is where I used to come after school when I was your age. The community center. They run all kinds of programs here. After-school tutoring, sports, arts, and even some leadership workshops. It's where I got involved in stuff that helped me get my life together. I wanted to show it to you because, well, I think it might be something you'd be interested in." Layla looked at him skeptically. "Leadership workshops. I don't know if I'm the leadership type." Marcus chuckled. "You'd be surprised. You've been leading for a while now, even if you didn't realize it. And this place, it helped me realize that I didn't have to be stuck in the life I thought I was destined for. I think it could do the same for you." Layla bit her lip, unsure. The idea of being around other kids her age, kids who weren't dealing with the kind of problems she had at home, felt intimidating. She wasn't like them. She'd been forced to grow up fast, and the thought of trying to fit in with a bunch of strangers made her stomach knot. But she trusted Marcus, and if he thought this place could help, maybe it was worth giving it a shot. "What would I even do here?" Layla asked, still wary. Marcus smiled. "Whatever you want. They got workshops on public speaking, creative writing, even debate teams. You can pick something that interests you." The mention of creative writing caught Layla's attention. She had always loved writing, though it was a passion she had never really had time to explore. Stories had been her escape when life got too hard, but they were just that, an escape. Could she really turn something she enjoyed into something more? Seeing her expression change slightly, Marcus nodded toward the entrance. "Simon, let's check it out." Inside the community center, the atmosphere was buzzing with energy. Kids of all ages were scattered around, some working on art projects, others playing basketball in the gym, while a group of older teens huddled around a table, deep in discussion. Layla followed Marcus down a hallway, her curiosity piqued by the colorful posters lining the walls, advertising different programs and events. They reached a room where a small group of students was gathered around a woman who was writing on a whiteboard. The sign on the door read Creative Writing Workshop. Lila hesitated in the doorway, her heart racing as she peered inside. "Go ahead," Marcus encouraged her. "You don't have to join today, but why not just sit in and see what it's about?" Layla swallowed hard and stepped into the room, taking a seat near the back. The woman leading the workshop smiled warmly at her, but didn't pressure her to introduce herself. As the discussion continued, Layla listened intently. They were talking about using personal experiences to fuel creativity, turning moments of pain, joy, and fear into stories that could resonate with others. For the first time in a long while, something sparked inside Lila. These were kids just like her. Maybe they hadn't lived through the exact same struggles, but they had their own stories to tell. And in this room, it felt safe to share those stories. The more she listened, the more she realized that she had a voice too, and it was one worth sharing. After the workshop ended, Marcus was waiting for her in the hallway. "Well, what did you think?" Layla shifted on her feet, feeling awkward but excited at the same time. "It was different. I think I might like it. I didn't say anything today, but maybe next time I will." Marcus grinned. "That's all I wanted to hear. You've got a lot to say, Layla. I can see it in you. You don't have to share it all at once, but when you're ready, I think people are going to listen." Layla looked down at her feet, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, the idea of the future didn't seem so scary. Maybe she didn't have everything figured out yet, but she was starting to see that her life could be more than just survival. She could make her own choices, and maybe even make a difference, just like Marcus had. Over the next few weeks, Layla started attending the creative writing workshop regularly. She didn't always participate, but she soaked in every bit of advice, every technique the teacher offered. Slowly, she began to write about her life, the things she had experienced, the things she had felt. At first, the words were clumsy and jumbled, but as she kept writing, they began to flow more naturally. One evening, she finally shared a piece of her writing with the group. It was a short story about a girl who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had lost so much but never lost her will to keep going. As she read aloud, her voice trembled at first, but with each word, her confidence grew. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, applause filled the space. Layla looked around, her heart pounding in her chest, but not from fear, from something else. Pride. For the first time, she had spoken her truth, and people had listened. It felt like a release, like she had let go of something heavy she'd been carrying for too long. Afterward, the workshop leader approached her. "Layla, that was powerful," she said softly. "You've got a real gift. I hope you keep writing." Layla smiled, her chest swelling with a sense of accomplishment. "I will." That night, as Layla sat on her porch, watching the stars twinkle in the dark sky, she realized something profound. She had found her voice, something that had been buried under years of hardship, fear, and responsibility. And now that she had found it, she wasn't going to let it go. Life wasn't perfect. Her grandmother's condition was still deteriorating, and there were days when the weight of it all felt like too much. But now Lila had something to hold on to, something that was hers. She was more than just a girl struggling to survive. She was a writer, a storyteller, and maybe, one day, a leader. And for the first time in her life, she believed in her own strength. The power of story. As winter approached, the chill in the air seemed to match the growing heaviness in Leila's heart. Her grandmother's health was declining faster than any of them had expected. There were days when Mrs. Ellis didn't wake up until the afternoon, her once lively spirit now dulled by fatigue and confusion. Some mornings, when Layla brought her breakfast, her grandmother's eyes would be empty, distant, like she had already begun to slip away. One particularly cold morning, Lila sat beside her grandmother's bed, holding her frail hand, unsure of what to say. It was hard seeing the woman who had raised her, who had once been so strong and unshakable, now so fragile. Lila had always thought of her grandmother as the person who had all the answers, the person who could make anything better, no matter how bad things got. But now it was Layla who had to be the strong one, and that shift felt heavy. "Layla," Mrs. Ellis whispered suddenly, her voice weak but clear. Layla leaned closer, surprised. Her grandmother hadn't spoken much in days. "Yeah, Grandma, I'm here." For a moment, her grandmother just stared at her, as if she were trying to remember something important. You're a good girl," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Tears welled up in Leela's eyes. She had always known her grandmother loved her, but hearing those words now, when she feared they might be some of the last her grandmother ever spoke to her, broke something open inside of her. "I love you, Grandma," she whispered, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm going to take care of you, okay? I'll make sure you're comfortable. I promise." Her grandmother didn't respond, her eyes closing again as she drifted back into sleep. Lila sat there for a long time, her mind racing with memories of the woman who had been her rock, the woman who had sacrificed so much to raise her. It wasn't fair, she thought, that life had dealt them so many hard blows, that her grandmother should have to suffer like this. But Layla also knew that life wasn't about fairness. It was about resilience, about getting back up, no matter how many times you were knocked down. That night, as Layla sat at the kitchen table, the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the background, she opened her notebook and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, each one feeling heavy and raw. But as she kept going, something shifted. Her hand began to move faster across the page, the story unfolding with a force that surprised her. She wrote about her grandmother, about the way she had taken her in when no one else would, about the late nights spent listening to old records and the smell of her baking bread in the kitchen. She wrote about the lessons her grandmother had taught her, not through words but through action, about how to be strong, how to be kind, how to never give up, even when life seemed impossibly hard. But more than anything, Layla wrote about the love they shared, a love that wasn't always easy, a love that had been tested and stretched thin, but a love that had never broken. And as she wrote, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her, as if putting the story into words was helping her process the grief she had been carrying inside. When she finally put her pen down, hours had passed, and the room was dark, save for the dim light of the kitchen lamp. Layla stared at the pages in front of her, her heart pounding. This was more than just a story. It was a tribute, a way to keep her grandmother's spirit alive, even as her body faded. It was a way to honor the woman who had given her everything. Layla knew then that she couldn't keep this story to herself. It wasn't enough to write it down and tuck it away in her notebook. Her grandmother's story, their story, deserved to be shared. Maybe, just maybe, it could help someone else going through something similar. Maybe it could remind others that even in the darkest moments, there was still light, still hope. A few days later, Layla attended the creative writing workshop with a new sense of purpose. She had shared stories before, but this time felt different. This time, she was sharing a piece of her soul. As she stood in front of the group, her hands shaking slightly, she took a deep breath and began to read. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced with emotion. She read about the way her grandmother's hands had always been rough but gentle, how they had comforted her through every scrape and bruise, every tear. She read about the nights she had spent sitting by her grandmother's bedside, the fear and sadness that had threatened to overwhelm her but never quite did. And she read about the love, a fierce, unbreakable love that had held them together through it all. When she finished, the room was silent. Layla looked up, expecting to see polite smiles, or maybe a few nods of acknowledgement. Instead, she saw tears. Real, genuine tears. The workshop leader, who had always been so composed, wiped her eyes and gave Layla a small, encouraging smile. "That was powerful," she said softly. "Thank you for sharing that with us, Lila. Your words, they carry so much weight. You have a gift." Layla didn't know what to say. She had never thought of herself as someone who could move others with her words. Writing had always been a personal escape, a way to process her own emotions. But now, seeing the impact her story had on the people around her, she realized that maybe her writing could be more than that. Maybe it could be a way to connect, to heal, not just for herself, but for others too. As the weeks went by, Layla's writing became her lifeline. She wrote about everything: the pain, the joy, the small moments of peace she found in unexpected places. She wrote about the stars she watched from her porch at night, about the dreams she had once let go of but was now starting to reclaim. And through it all, she found strength in her words, in the act of telling her story. Her relationship with Marcus deepened too. He became more than just the sheriff who had stepped in when she needed help. He became a mentor, a friend, someone who believed in her even when she didn't fully believe in herself. Marcus encouraged her to submit her stories to local contests, to consider sharing them beyond the workshop. At first, Layla was hesitant. The idea of putting her words out into the world for strangers to read felt vulnerable, scary. But Marcus had a way of pushing her just enough to make her see what she was capable of. "Your story matters, Layla," he told her one afternoon, as they sat outside the community center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You've been through so much, and the fact that you're still standing, still fighting, that's something people need to hear. You can help others by sharing what you've been through." Layla thought about that for a long time. Could her story really make a difference? Could her words help someone else the way writing had helped her? In the spring, a local writing competition announced its annual call for submissions. The theme was resilience. Layla stared at the flyer for days, unsure of whether she had the courage to enter. But eventually, with Marcus's encouragement and the unwavering support of the creative writing group, she submitted her piece, the one about her grandmother, about love and loss, about finding strength in the hardest of times. Weeks passed, and Layla tried not to think about the contest. She knew that winning wasn't the point. The real victory had been in writing the story, in finding her voice. But when the email arrived, her heart raced as she opened it. She had won. She had won. Layla could hardly believe it. She sat there, staring at the screen, her mind spinning. She had won. Her story, her grandmother's story, had resonated with people she had never met. It had touched them in a way she hadn't thought possible. When she told Marcus, he grinned from ear to ear. "I told you, Layla. I told you that you had something special. Now the rest of the world knows it too." The awards ceremony was small but meaningful. As Layla stood on stage, holding the plaque they had given her, she felt a rush of emotions: pride, gratitude, love. Her grandmother couldn't be there with her physically, but Layla felt her presence, her strength, in every word she had written. She realized then that her story wasn't just about her grandmother, it was about herself too. It was about the journey she had taken, the battles she had fought, the person she had become. And though life still wasn't easy, though the road ahead was uncertain, Layla knew one thing for sure. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it go. In the months that followed, Layla kept writing. She kept sharing her stories, not just about her grandmother, but about the world she saw around her, the beauty, the pain, the hope. And as her words spread, so did her confidence. She had discovered the power of story, the power of her voice, and she knew that as long as she kept telling the truth, she would never be alone.